Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this latest teaching session in the course on technology and the future of medicine. Today we're talking about FutureHype, and Geoffrey Rockwell is giving the main presentation. I just have a few remarks. I thought it was interesting that with David Pearce's response to the video from his teaching session, he felt that the students should also consider these big picture questions of whether the future will be various kinds of singularity outcomes. And I actually thought the session was just fine the way it is with the focus that we had, but just to sort of go over those outcomes, because I think they're also relevant to today. If there is inappropriate hyping of the kind of subject matter that we're talking about in this course, then it would be surrounding these ideas. First of all, the technological singularity, as we've defined it over and over, where machines become smarter than we are, take over the agenda of the world. And we can then only conceptualize and understand what's going on if we cooperate with those sentient machines in some way. And they'll be able to self-improve much more quickly than human beings can. So that's the basic idea. And that idea could come about in many different ways. There are three main schools of belief about it. One focuses on accelerating change. The other focuses on the uncertainty of the event horizon. And the third focuses around intelligence explosion. And then within any of those three schools, you can then have four main paths. Number one, you can create an AI that exceeds human intelligence. Number two, you can build a cyborg. You can build a human-computer interface that allows humans to go beyond their innate intelligence to a significant extent. So brain enhancement, brain implants, that kind of thing. A combined cooperation between the human brain and machines. The third is what David Pearce was talking about in the last lecture, genetically or through other means, finding ways for biology to improve upon the natural human intellect. So this course is entitled Technology and the Future of Medicine. Sometimes it seems like it's 99% technology in the future and 1% technology in the future of medicine, but this particular path would require physicians. It's hard to see how you could get there without that. The other paths would not. And the fourth path is sort of where the internet wakes up. You build a large computer network in which beyond human intelligence emerges. So the idea of this course and the background of a significant number of people in this course has to do with the training we obtained at Singularity University. It's true of me, it's true of Shauna Pandya, and now Jonathan White, who's also just recently coming back from training there. And we there learned about all these various schools and paths. So, and it's a very vivid experience that grows once you finish it, rather than diminishing. Most educational experiences, the time it's over, you rapidly forget most of what you learned, and it's a very small pinpoint in your mind, whereas this grows and grows. And Ray Kurzweil, who's one of the founders of Singularity University, has beliefs and interests just as broad as what I've just presented. All three schools, all four paths. And so when you hear somebody arguing that he has very narrow beliefs and he doesn't get this, he doesn't get that, then they're wrong. And the other thing is, if they're assuming that he's not accessible, they're also wrong about that anybody complaining would be able to reach him, and they would be amazed at the quality of the argument that would be coming back. And then there's the interesting phenomenon of Moore's law, which we bring up over and over. And Moore's law is probably muted in medicine. For a lot of reasons, it just doesn't work as well as fast. It's not in the same kind of curve. There are more inhibitory forces. So it's an interesting challenge, figuring out what to do about the fact that the rest of mankind is kind of accelerating faster than physicians are, because we're held back by various things. So this was kind of the background that I thought would be useful for today. And now I'll pass the microphones over to Geoffrey Rockwell, who knows a great deal about humanities computing and other things associated with that.
Well, so first of all, I'd like to thank you all for inviting me to come and speak. And I think when I gave a title to Kim, I gave a somewhat inflated title when I called my talk FutureHype. Of course, when it came to writing the talk and planning it, I'm the sort of person that always decides that he can't make as important claims as he thought he could before. And so I've boiled it down to near futures for technology. I want to start just with a historical example, because you guys are looking forward, but it's always fun, and I come from the humanities, to look back. In 1964, the Globe and Mail ran a special supplement in which they imagined what the world would be 50 years later, which is actually in 2 years, 2014. And they imagined a world of schools without teachers, buses without drivers, a world in which men and women select their marriage partner by computer, a world of push-button farming and garden vegetables 12 feet in diameter, a world of gigantic industrial plants operated by a single man. What's interesting about this is how much they got right and how much they got wrong, and how our perceptions of what they got right and wrong have changed. If we go through some of these predictions for the future, schools without teachers, we're looking at here at the University of Alberta, we're looking at experiments with MOOCs. So while we don't have schools without teachers, we do have some interesting experiments in self-directed learning. I think MOOCs are a good example of that. Buses without drivers. We have Google has been experimenting with driverless cars, and the state of California has actually changed its laws to allow these driverless cars to actually operate on the roads. So we don't have it as something that we can all experience, but the technology has moved since 1964. A world in which men and women select their marriage partner by computer. Well, I've got a graduate student who has been going through the gateway. We've been looking at how the student paper here at the University of Alberta presents computing, how they talk about computing. One thing that shows up over and over again is computerized dating. You guys have been interested in computerized dating for a while, maybe not you in particular. And of course, nowadays, a lot of my children tell me that a lot of youth actually use the online dating services. These are now, these have gone from being something that only the nerds use to something that busy young professionals use. So computerized dating seems to have come. Push-button farming is a little bit different, though I think there's been a lot of automation in farming. And I don't know about you guys, but every time I buy strawberries from California, they may not be 12 feet in diameter, but they look unnaturally big. Have you noticed, certain strawberries especially are getting really, really big, maybe 12 inches in diameter. And in terms of gigantic industrial plants operated by a single person, we have those too. We've seen automation across the board. What I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about what we do when we try to predict the future, because it's a very human activity. Then what I want to do is to look at some histories of how the future has been predicted, because we're not the first ones. Ray Kurzweil is not the first person to predict the future, predict singularities. We're not the first people to get excited about the future. It's actually, I think, a very human endeavor to be interested, to be hopeful about the future. And so I want to look at some particular examples that I know something about. And then I want to look at, I want to actually participate in this and look at what some of the other literature is saying to give you some different predictions about the future. Ray Kurzweil is one very focused prediction, but there's a lot of other predictions out there. And specifically, I want to show you some predictions about the near future, which is perhaps, these are the less dangerous predictions and the ones that we do every day. You know, what's going to happen next year? What's going to happen the next 5 years? And then lastly, I want to finish with a little bit of philosophy of technology and how philosophers have been thinking about technology and the discourse around technology. And some of this is sort of applicable to Ray Kurzweil, but maybe not directly. And since Kim reminds us that his thinking is much broader than what we might imagine, I'm not going to focus it so much on a critique of Kurzweil so much as introducing some ideas that I think are worth keeping in mind by other thinkers that are very broad thinkers. So what are we doing when we try to predict the future in technology? This is HerbertSimon, who, if you haven't read him or heard about him, you should. Because Simon, in many ways, is the predecessor to Kurzweil. He was one of the really leading figures of cybernetics, one of the first people to build a working AI system of any sort, and somebody who himself predicted that, he actually predicted that we'd have all sorts of stuff by the late 1960s. He got a certain amount wrong, but he was a towering figure in the field of the early field of computer science and computation. And what he says is that whenever we try to forecast the future, whether it's economic, social, or technical, we always do so on the basis of the things that have happened in the past and with which we are familiar. And then he goes on to make a point that we do so, that we forecast by analogy. Our forecasts are never proofs. They're always based on an analogy that the future is going to, in some fashion or another, be analogous to the present. So another person who talks about prediction and future, and this is a book actually called FutureHype, and I recommend it to you. It is, like Kurzweil, it's also very readable, it's very, very entertaining and something like that, and it is full of examples of how predictions for the future have gone wrong. When he talks about predictions, he's more of a pessimist. Simon, despite that quote, was actually very much a futurist or an optimist in how he went about predictions. He just felt that we had to be careful. Some of the things that Seidensticker, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his name right, argues, first of all, he mentions a different law, Amara's law, which is that we tend to, as humans, overestimate short-term changes and underestimate long-term changes. This is sort of based partly on cognitive science and the way we as humans, we tend to notice and pay more attention to what is immediately in front of us or what has happened recently, and we don't notice long, slow changes. Some of you have probably heard I don't even know if this is actually true, but it's a nice analogy, the frog and in the water story. You know, if you throw a frog into boiling water, it'll notice the change in temperature and jump out. But if you put a frog in cold water and turn the heat up, and the water slowly gets warmer and warmer, the frog won't notice the change in temperature and will not leap out and will not save itself. And this story, if you will, and I have no idea whether or not frogs actually leap out. In fact, I suspect the frog would be sensible and leap out anyway. Probably leap out simply because it was bored, or it saw a fly moving around or something like that. But anyway, this story is often used to explain Amara's law, to illustrate it, to show that we tend to be we're the type of thinking thing that notices what happens close to us. We infer a lot of things from our own anecdotal experience. And as a result, we often miss the long-term changes. A second thing he says is that the history of technology and technological change is one of unintended consequences. The people developing the technologies think they are developing something for one purpose, And it turns out to have deep consequences in other areas unrelated to the purposes that they designed it for. A good example is the internet. The internet was designed, depending on who you listen to, one theory is that the internet was designed to provide a nuclear strike, a communications network that would bypass the censorship of a nuclear strike, something that could survive nuclear war and allow the U.S. Defense Forces to be able to continue to communicate. I think that, to some extent, is an argument that was introduced to get funding a little bit later. The initial requests for proposals that went out from DARPA were actually looking to save money. They were asking for an internet, for the internet technologies. They were asking for these technologies to be developed and deployed because they were tired of giving big computers to every university. And what they wanted to do was to be able to give little computers to a bunch of universities and have an internet so that they could send jobs, processes off to the few big ones that they gave. They did not imagine email. Email was actually email, which was the first of a series of social technologies that now dominate the internet traffic, was really a little bit of a hack for sending messages that was introduced in about 1974. So that's a case of unintended consequences. We built something with one purpose in mind, and it turns out doing something else. A third thing he says, which I got a little slide to show you in a second, is, and this sort of ties to the way we overestimate short-term changes, is that we tend to think that the things that we are in the middle of are exponential. And I've got a slide in a moment that will show that. And the last thing he talks about, well, not the last, he talks about a lot of stuff, is the effect of our attention. This is something that is very human. When we pay attention to things, we actually change them. And technological change is itself something that the media is fascinated in. But the media is not fascinated and does not report technological change consistently. They tend to report what we want to read, which is the gee whiz near future stuff. They don't report the long-term slow changes. In general, you don't hear that crime is dropping in Canada. You read that every once in a while. What you see in the media is, somebody yesterday rolled a car over and killed somebody else, or a drunken driver did this. You get a lot more studies, a lot more stories about the immediate, the human, and a lot less about the long term. And the same is true of technology and the way it is reported. So what do I mean by exponential change? So exponential change is the sort of change where the change itself is accelerating. And this is where I'm tempted to wander over, and of course I'm not allowed to do that. So if you look at that chart down at the bottom, when people look at Moore's law and look at a lot of technological change, they tend to see the first half. They see something that is accelerating and changing faster and faster. In fact, if you look at the history of technology, most technologies go through an S-curve. They go through a period of acceleration, and eventually they stabilized. And when they and so they go through this sort of S-curve. I mean, there it says stagnation. Stabilization is probably a better word. But when you're in the elbow, or when you're in the takeoff phase, what you're going to see and what you're going to predict based upon, you're going to say, this is just going to keep on taking off. Let me give you another example, the economy. So the chart above, the Globe and Mail on the weekend had a great 2-page spread which showed the Dow Jones and American stocks. I was not able to find that in digital form. Instead, this is the TSX, but you can see more or less the same thing. It's not quite as dramatic. You see, it's sort of linear, and then somewhere around the 1980s, it begins to rocket. And I don't know how much you know about recent economics, but a whole mess of people begin to think, oh my God, the economy's rocketing. Then people begin to say, well, this is going to keep on happening. Then they began to do stupid things with our pensions. They began to do stupid things with our mortgages, something like that. Somewhere around 2001, boom, we had this crash, but then it picked up again. Everyone sort of said, okay, well, that was just a hiccup. In the case of the whole dot-com industry, we maybe got a little bit carried away about e-commerce because they were in the 90s, the predictions about e-commerce and how it was going to take off, they're completely overblown. so there's a bit of a correction in 2001. Everybody goes, okay, but it's still good. You know, we've had a little bit of a correction, but it's still accelerating up. You know, buy, you know, get subprime mortgages, put money into anything. It's all going to go up. And then 2007 hits, and pow! Now it begins to look as if this curve, the long-term curve, is not one of accelerating value, but is an S curve, where we had a sort of explosion of new financial instruments starting in the 80s. We moved a whole mess of things that before were not really in the stock market, like real estate. We moved them into the stock market, and then there's a stabilization, and that's what we're in right now. In fact, you guys, you know, when I was younger, everybody said buy real estate, you can't possibly lose money. Now they're probably telling you don't buy real estate, rent. It's not worth it unless you have other reasons to buy. So that's an example of an S curve. That's an example where people over-predicted, where people extrapolated from where they were in the curve to where it was going to be. They drew an analogy into the future and assumed that it was going to be somewhere else. That's not to say that all phenomena are S curves. This is what's so great about being human. We simply cannot predict with complete certainty. But certainly technological change seems to follow an S curve function. So now what I want to do is to give you some examples of how technologies have been discussed over time. So I'm now going into the past and looking at some technologies, if you will, of the mind, but more general than AI, technologies that have been predicted and discussed. The first one is the greatest technology of all, which is the alphabet, writing, reading, the technology of language, especially written language. And we can go back to Plato, 300 BC. Plato has, in his dialogue, the Phaedrus, has a neat little story in which two characters talk about the technology of writing and what it will do. And one character, and you have to remember, this is actually Socrates telling a story about two Egyptian gods, so he's telling a myth. So Thamos and Thoth are not real characters. For that, Socrates is a historic character, but the way Plato, we don't know for sure that what Plato wrote is what Socrates said. Anyway, so Socrates is telling this story about technology, and the way he sets up the story is you have the inventor, and the inventor, Thoth, sort of says, well, I have invented this cool thing, the alphabetic writing, and this will make Egyptians wiser. Why will it make it wiser? Why will it make them wiser? Because it will replace their memory. And you have to remember, in those days, a smart man was a person who could remember a lot. They didn't have all the memory tools that we have. A smart man was someone who could quote you back Homer, or quote back the whatever, or could remember the seasons, or could remember how much he owed you, or you owed him, or something like that. So memory was very important in a semi-oral society. In fact, the educational system in oral societies was almost entirely built around helping people memorize stuff so that they could hold the information in their head and teaching them memory techniques. And along comes this sort of Promethean, half God, half man, and he says, look, I got this technology which will make it so much easier for people to remember stuff because they can write it down and then they can call it up, and this will make them wiser. And Thamos rightly replies, well, that's pretty cool, but the person who invents a technology isn't always the best one to judge it. So that's his first point, is and this is sort of fundamental to the history of the philosophy of technology. It is not always the case that the people who make this stuff are the ones who actually know what it's going to be best for. And then he makes a second point that, in fact, this knowledge technology that you developed, what evidence do you have that it's going to make us any wiser? Yes, it might replace our memory. Yes, it'll externalize our memory, but that's not going to necessarily make us any wiser. And there is, to my knowledge, no evidence that any technology has ever made us wiser. I would love to hear somebody sort of propose one that has. And to be fair, I can't think of any work of art that has necessarily been proven to make us wiser. It's not entirely clear what makes us wiser. We still kill each other with the same frequency and energy that we used to. So, in fact, now we got better toys to do it, and we even have toys that simulate it and so on. So that's Plato. Jumping ahead to, not the 16th century, here is a really cool, so now I'm going to focus really on reading machines. Here's Ramelli, and he wrote a work about diverse and artificial machines in which, among other things, he imagined a reading machine, and you see a picture of it here. What's intriguing about this is what was his reason for developing this machine. And he says, this machine will be very useful and convenient for anyone who takes pleasure in study. You guys all take pleasure in study, I hope. That's why you're here in school, and you'll be in school for the rest of your life. Especially those who are indisposed and tormented by gout. So if you have gout, you know, instead of having to get up and move around to get books and so on like that, you can have you can stay in your seat and turn this big crank of a thing, and you can get all these books and move them back and forth. Jumping ahead, H.G.Wells in his idea of the Permanent World Encyclopedia, 1937, he sits there and imagines, by the means of the microfilm, the rarest and most intricate documents and articles can be studied now at first hand simultaneously in a score of projection rooms. There's no practical obstacle whatever now to the creation of an efficient index to all human knowledge, ideas, and achievements, to the creation, that is, of a complete planetary memory for all mankind. It foreshadows a real intellectual unification of our race. And this is something that we hear over and over again about technology, is that if we get this new technology and it helps us think better, this is going to bring peace and unify people and make us understand each other better, and so on, so on, so on. Here's an example from 1935. I got this off a very cool blog called Paleo Future, which is full of examples of how people imagined the future that didn't quite happen. But you know, people were fascinated by microfilm. Here is a sort of a microfilm reader that you can sit on your couch or whatever like that and have access, as H.G. Wells imagined, to this world literature. This is the Memex from 1945, and it's from an illustration of an article called As We May Think by Vannevar Bush. And Vannevar Bush was extremely important. He was Roosevelt's science advisor. He designed one of the first electromechanical computers. Before the ENIAC, he was building not a digital computer, but a sort of mechanical computer for doing certain types of numeric calculations. He was dean at MIT, and As We May Think is probably one of the most important documents in the history of computing. Because one of the things he sets out to do in As We May Think is he asks the question, and he writes this right at the end of World War II. He says, we've used, and by we he means the United States, we have built a tremendous technological and scientific establishment that has won the war. What are we going to do? What are the problems we're going to tackle now that we have peace? Are we going to just sort of, you know, tear it all down, and or can we use this scientific technical administration in peaceful ways? And he sets out to set an agenda of things that we should look at. And one of the things he sets out is of course thinking tools, and in particular the problem that we still all face and feel strongly, which is the problem of too much information. How can we manage the immense amounts of information? And he imagines what today we call hypertext, or the World Wide Web. Now, he doesn't yet know about digital computers and the internet, so his system, his Memex, is based on microfilms, reels of microfilms, but the idea is very similar to the web, that you can put up information and create links from one place in the information to another, and then create paths and trails to the information, and in effect create new information from old information. And Vannevar Bush's ideas influenced Ted Nelson, who in '64 coins the word hypertext, which in turn influenced Tim Berners-Lee, who in '89 with his colleagues at CERN developed the World Wide Web, whose protocols, for those of you who are into this sort of thing, if you know them, HTML, what does that stand for? Hypertext Markup Language. HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So we have, you know, it is Vannevar Bush's ideas from the 40s that end up in their slow way influencing, you know, the intellectual technology that's probably made the greatest impact on us nowadays. Jumping ahead, 1962. Here you see this. This was a fairly influential comic, where essentially scientists began to sort of work with artists to develop a sort of comic that sort of made science accessible. And here you can see something, you see a sort of system. Again, this one is not based on microfilm the way Vannevar Bush's and H.G.Wells was. This is now based on television. But you can see the idea also that ideas that come to fruition on the web, the idea of accessing information from thousands of miles away and so on like that. And jumping ahead, I'm gonna skip that. This is one of the first, this is intermedia, it's one of the first networked hypertext systems. This is before the internet has really taken off. And of course now we have the World Wide Web, and we have what a lot of these people imagined. And with e-books and iBooks and Kindles and so on like that, we have a future that's not exactly what they imagined, but it has a number of the features of it. So what inferences or what lessons can we draw from this type of history? The first is that when people imagine a future technology, they almost always extrapolate from the technologies they have at that time and at hand. So, you know, Ramelli knew about wood and gears, so his reading machine is made out of wood and gears. H.G.Wells is fascinated by microfilm, as is Vannevar Bush, so their future technology is made out of, it uses microfilm. We get into the 60s and television is the hot new technology, so people are imagining television connecting people over great distances, and so on and so on and so on. We tend to extrapolate from what we know and have here. And that's not actually a problem, because often what we're doing when we extrapolate is we're talking about what matters to us now. So the extrapolation, you know, whether or not it is true for the future, the question is whether or not it is meaningful to us now. It's also interesting to ask what problems do we imagine these future technologies solving? And what do they say about our perception of the problems right now? Ramelli thinks gout is a problem. Gout, I'm not even sure I know exactly what gout is, but I'm assuming it's sort of joint trouble and so on like that.
Yeah, it's where you have problems with uric acid deposition. It's a metabolic disease. It's related to both genetic things and also dietary excess. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a complicated, interesting disease that many famous authors have found it fun to write about.
Yeah. So, you know, then jumping ahead to, we have the beeping technology problem. Then jumping ahead to Vannevar Bush, in some ways a problem that is still with us, in which we all, I think, experience, is the problem of too much information and how to handle all this information. In fact, Clay Shirky gives a great talk in which he says, which he points out, in which, you know, any journalist who is looking for a hook to write a story about technology is guaranteed to get his editor's approval if he starts with the question of what do you do with too much information? Because that's something we all sort of feel. Clay Shirky is also interesting on this because he says that's not the real problem. The problem is filtering, but that's another story. Then we have the problem of access to information, the access to information which is at a distance, at remote places. How do you get at the British Library when you're not in London? And H.G.Wells, of course, has the problem of education and peace and goodwill towards mankind. So we see one of the lessons we learn from the history of the predictions of technology is that they often tell us about the problems that are happening at that time and what people perceived as being the problems. And I guess one of the things I ask about any prediction, including those that I make, is, you know, what anxiety am I scratching? And what does that tell me about what I'm anxious about right now? Let me give you another example. This is one that I fell, this is I'm going to call it a trap, if you will, that I fell into hook, line, and sinker, and it's virtual reality. Any of you see Lawnmower Man? Yes. That was one of the best lousy movies I've ever seen. One of the things that made it so good is that the directors got permission to use a lot of the current technology. If you ever go back and look at Lawnmower Man, you will see that they were using VPL equipment that was in the labs at the time. In fact, it just made it out of the labs. It was sort of that sort of semi-commercial equipment that had come out of a lab and was available for other labs and scientific groups to do. This is sort of the extreme end. For those of you who haven't seen the movie, and believe me, I'm not spoiling anything, you know, in Lawnmower Man, somebody is sort of brought into a VR environment, and by the very end, they actually disappear. It's sort of a, if you will, a filmic exposition on the singularity. They sort of disappear at the very end. They get sort of sucked into it. If any of you have ever seen the original Tron, you'll know the same thing happens. This idea of human beings being sucked into the digital world is one that has been dealt with in all sorts of beautiful ways. In Tron, it happens at the beginning of the movie when who is it, Jeff Bridges? Something goes wrong, and all of a sudden the scanning laser in effect decompiles him and reads him at the same time, and bink, he shows up inside the game. And the first Tron is great. Any of you who saw the recent Tron should forget that experience and go back to the first one, which is absolutely fabulous, and is probably one of the first movies about virtual reality, though they didn't have that phrase then. They called it counterfeit reality. So that's Tron. So so talking personally, how I fell into the trap of thinking that virtual reality was just around the corner comes from what Simon calls or what some people call a projection. To me, I was working and studying and writing in the 80s. To me, there seemed an obvious trajectory of interface, starting from the one-dimensional interfaces that we use, the sort of, if any of you have ever used a time-sharing system, probably not, but if any of you ever used MS-DOS, or now if you're computer weenies and you use Unix, and on your Macs or your PCs, you call up the command line, that's a one-dimensional interface. And then all of a sudden in 1984, the Apple Macintosh came along. Now, it introduced to the larger public a technology that had been around in Xerox for 10 years and been developed, but it introduced a two-dimensional interface. We went from typing these little lines of text and so on like that, we went from the calligraphic screen to the full graphical user interface. And it seemed obvious to us that the next step was 3D. To put on these big heavy helmets and so on like that, put on the data gloves, and get right into the space of the computer. And I promise you, I gave talks to excited undergraduates, or they were probably bored out of their minds, but I was excited. And I'd talk about these technologies and so on and like that, and it didn't happen. Or maybe it did. What happened? Here is Jaron Lanier. You'll start to be able to experience virtual reality within a few years. He has recently, by the way, written a very skeptical book of technology. But in the 90s, in the late 80s, he was as excited as I was. There will be virtual reality rooms at universities and students can do their projects in. So on and so on and so on and so on. What happened? Well, in fact, what happened was computers got a lot smaller. Instead of us entering them, they adapted to us. The mobile phone, which in the 80s looked like that. Nobody thought that this was going to go anywhere. Certainly didn't think you were going to have access to the internet through a mobile phone. The internet happened, the web happened. The internet was already in existence in the 80s, but it wasn't something that any of us could use. Or, I could do FTP on it and get access to various machines, but it was very complicated. The smartphone came along and was a disruptive technology. But what's interesting, and one of the lessons to be learned, is that virtual reality also happened. World of Warcraft, Second Life, first-person shooters. So in some ways, the predictions were wrong and right. And how does that happen? Well, one of the reasons that they're wrong and right is that what is predicted happens, but nobody cares as much. Because in the very act of predicting it, we almost exhaust the subject. And it's what surprises us that we pay attention to. That's what the media. You don't find the media, the media was in the 90s, we're all excited about data gloves and stuff like that, and then it was old hat. And what was cool were the cell phones, and the iPhones, and the iPad minis, and who knows what'll be cool next. How am I doing for time? Does that mean lots of it, or?
Yeah.
Okay, so another thing I want to talk about is space. I talked about virtual reality, but now I want to step back. Because one of the things that we do when we get things wrong is we ask, why did we get it wrong? One of the things that I got wrong, I know, was I was too focused on the interface. And I wasn't asking myself, how were we going to interact with computers in what spaces? And if you step back and think about space, some of you may know Jeremy Bentham. He was a late 18th, early 19th century social political philosopher, and we often associate the term panopticon with him. And this is Kernan Jail in Dublin, which you can see if you go there. It is no longer operational. And if any of you, some of you might even recognize this jail because it's shown up in various movies. But Kernan Jail is an example of a panopticon. These were people who were designing spaces so that other people could be observed. If you stand at the top of either the first sort of cross bridge or the second one, you can hear everything that's happening in all the jail cells and see into them if they are open or the windows are open. So one person, one or two people, jailers, can hear what everybody is up to. Now, panopticon means optic, means seeing, seeing everyone, and Bentham, and it was actually his brother who built the first panopticon, were building these spaces where managers could oversee and see all of the prisoners or all the people who were working. This is actually a panaudion. It was designed more so that the police could hear what was going on. This is, by the way, where a lot of the Irish rebels from like the 1916 were jailed and so on like that. How different is that from this? This is the AT&T control room, which is another use of space which is designed so that a group of people can see the world however they define the world. Think of the NASA space, whenever you see movies or TV things about NASA and the space shots and so on like that, you see examples of spaces that are designed so that we can manage information at a distance. And this is probably the most fanciest one out there. Nowadays, it's becoming affordable. This is the Hyperwall at the University of Southern California. This has, I think, 10 by 50 Apple 30-inch monitors. So it allows, these types of digital panopticons are being downsized and made into things that universities like U of A can afford. In fact, this is the access grid room, which is here in General Services, which is not quite as fancy as the Hyperwall or the AT&T Center, but it's got a bunch of projectors and you can get a lot of real estate. And in this case, it's hard to see this, but what's happening is video conferencing, where sort of high-end video conferencing around the world. And then, but this sort of large-scale use of space, a group of people at Xerox began to imagine more creative uses of the digital and space. And in particular, a technology called Liveboard was part of a whole series of experiments which led to what we now call ubiquitous computing, of what is going to happen and how can we integrate technology into our everyday spaces. And they began to experiment with using smart boards. The smart boards that we now have, they all descend from Xerox Liveboard technology, these smart boards in meeting rooms, specially designed meeting rooms, rolling meeting rooms. They all look a little bit clunky now, but these are the sort of precursors to this sort of smart classroom that we have here. This is back here at the University of Alberta, where we have the sort of smart classroom, and there you see my back and somebody else in a cave. The cave are these 3D spaces that we now have. The cave is actually a great example of a technology that was a dead end. Again, it was one of these VR technologies. So where are we now in terms of smart spaces? Well, I visited a lab in Sweden, which was, in my mind, one of the most interesting and complete uses of technology in a sort of teaching and learning space. They basically put screens all over the place. large flexible rooms with, if you look, you can actually see there are screens here. You know, wherever you are, you can fire up your laptop and throw it up on a screen and sit in a beanbag chair or something like that. They have screens on the ceilings. This screen is actually, because it's Sweden, it's something that we need to get here in Edmonton. You know, they have winters with, you know, lots of short days, so they install on the ceilings these cloud screens that actually have sunlight spectrum light and clouds moving across them, so you have this sort of feeling that you're out in whatever. You know, only the Swedes would come up with that, and I haven't yet seen it here. Data walls and so on. So the question is, you know, what's going to happen, or what can we do when screens are so cheap that they're everywhere? You know, what is it going to be like if we can paint the walls with something that can be addressed by a computer? And you see some examples here of screens all over. You know, bus shelters in London, buses in India, floor spaces that you've probably seen these in your walks. You have come across this sort of ubiquitous computing, where there is computing all over the place, not just in your pocket. So, I think I'm going to zip ahead here, and I want to talk about. I want to make a couple predictions. Having sort of looked at the history of predictions, having in some sense warned you about predictions, I also want to point out that predicting is a fundamental human activity. And you know, one word for it is hope. I don't think we will ever stop predicting. We might stop being wrong, which would be sort of nice, but I doubt that's going to happen. But I think predicting is itself something that we're tempted to do. And it is part of trying to anticipate our world. It's part of what it is to be human. And so I put together some of my predictions, but I don't think I really have a lot of time for them. Some of them you've probably already thought about. Gamification is something that you guys are already experimenting with, and I'm hoping you give them a lecture or introduce gamification, because and crowdsourcing. Gamification and crowdsourcing are interesting to me because they're almost the reverse of what I would call the AI tendency. These are about reintroducing the human and getting tasks done by humans. If any of you are into science fiction, you should read the recent book, Read Me. It's not Read Me, Reamed. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, but it's about gamification and crowdsourcing. Proliferation of interfaces. I'm convinced that interface is becoming, is like a fashion. It's beginning to change rapidly and change in ways that have nothing to do really with improvement. They have to do more with fashion. You know, skirts go up, skirts go down, colors change, ties get wider, ties get narrower, and so on like that. And the change becomes something that we do for the fun of it. We play with these interfaces. You know, one of the things I love about the iPhone and the iPad is all the explosion of different interfaces. And lastly, physical computing. I'll show you some new interfaces. I was recently spent some time in Japan, and they do cool stuff with computer interfaces which you just don't see here. This is, I don't know, you know, this is one of those, they're really into these, what do you call them, photo booths. They have whole floors of photo booths where you and your friends go in, you get your pictures taken, then you mess them up, and then you print out an impossibly small set of little stickers that you can put all over the place. They have all these, this is like tabletop gaming systems here that multiple players can. This is one that uses cards and so on like that. This is, believe it or not, is actually a coin pusher game with a Super Mario theme that is a combination of sort of all sorts of physical toys, if you will, and the computer screen in the lower center corner there. It's essentially a form of gambling. Pachinko is another it's a combination of pinball and video lottery terminal and so on like that. There's more money spent in pachinko in Japan than on cars. It's an enormous, you know, economic thing, and it just hasn't left Japan for reasons that nobody quite understands. Pods, any of you fond of Gundam? You know, this is a networked, arcade-based pod system where you go in and, you know, shoot at other people. they experiment. This is a horse racing game. The Japanese are big into horse racing, yet another form of gambling for them. And it's a sort of classroom-sized networked horse racing thing. Imagine if your classes were ran like this. But so they experiment with interface in a way that I don't think we do, but I think it's coming. And physical computing is something that I also think is really important. And this is a cool phenomenon called the RepRap for reproductive printer or something like that. This is version 2. The goal of this project, and this is sort of the physical version of Kurzweil's AI Singularity. The goal of this project is to build a printer that can print itself. So it's not that the printer will just sort of wake up one day and start printing itself, but a printer that is capable of printing all the components which if assembled, would make the next printer. Why do I think this is important? And recently some researchers at MIT have sort of taken the idea a little bit further into what they call 4D printing, which they presented at a TED Talk in Boston the other day, which is the idea of printing things that can reassemble themselves in different ways. So they printed out this sort of this long sort of chain of components which actually can assemble themselves. And you'll find on the internet, you can find a video of these components assembling. And if they can assemble themselves in one way, then they can reassemble themselves in another way. So these are people who are exploring the idea, if you will, parallel to Kurzweil's singularity, of a physical singularity where we can begin to have machines that can physically reproduce themselves and can evolve. The 4D printing is a machine that could, in theory, they're trying to build the basic physical components that could evolve over time, and something is a car one day and then reconfigures itself like a transformer into a refrigerator or something. So I think that is something that is important. So I'm going to now end on a little bit of philosophy of technology. And I'm going to present the ideas of three people: Heidegger, Ellul, and Richard Dreyfus. Martin Heidegger is a German philosopher who is, at least in philosophy, is generally credited as being probably the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, if not all time, especially if you're in the continental school of philosophy. He's extremely influential. The existentialists all sort of draw ideas from him. One of the things that he thought a lot about was our everyday relationship with technology. And he came up with a fundamental distinction between the present at hand and the ready to hand. The ready to hand is a hammer. It's a hammer when you pick it up and hammer something with it. Now think about that activity, or a book when you pick it up and read it. You don't sit there and go, oh, this is a book, and it weighs, 200 grams, and it's made out of paper. No, you don't see it as an object. You see it as something that is ready to do something else with. And most of our relationship with technology is of this sort. When you get up in the morning, you don't hold the sweater up or the shirt and go, oh my God, what is this? It's cloth. It's woven. It came from China. No, you put it on. And you go, it's cold outside. I need a sweater. And you put a sweater on. Most of our interactions with technologies do not take this sort of at a distance objective, I'm going to stand back and look at it form. They take the form of using things. And why do we use things? How do we use them? Well, we use them in chains of agendas. So why do I put on clothes in the morning? Because I would be very cold if I went out without, proper footwear and clothing and stuff like that. And in addition, I would probably be very embarrassed if I came to this class naked. You would be embarrassed. You would be appalled. So we have all sorts of chains of reasonings that have to do with what we want to get on with in our life. They have to do with our dreams, our hopes. They have to do with what we want to achieve in the short term and in the long term. Why are you guys in university? Because you want to get a degree. Why do you want to get a degree? Because your parents want you to get one, or your girlfriend wants you to get one, or you want to get a job, or maybe you don't know what you're doing with it. But every day you use technology towards short-term ends, which are then used towards longer-term ends, which in some sense are used until the greatest end of all, which is death, at which point your agenda sort of ends. A second point that Heidegger doesn't make, a second point that Heidegger does make is that technology tends to be concatenated in complex contexts. You're driving along, you see a sign. The sign says, turn right for 84th Avenue or something like that. That sign cannot be interpreted alone. The only way you can understand that sign is if you understand roads and road systems and cars and driving. And the only way you can understand that is to understand that, transportation and so on like that. So each individual piece of technology cannot be understood alone. It's very tempting to take this, or to take the computer, or the semiconductor, or the chip, and say, ooh, let's pull this out of its context, and let's hold it up and make it present to hand and go, what is that? Well, most chips are, 5 grams, a little bit of silicon. That's not what they are. What they are is in these embedded contexts of technology. They're the chip that I pulled out of my Xbox that died, and I'm now turning it into a work of art, or whatever it is that happens. And related to that is a point that is made by other philosophers, is that we often miss there are two levels of technology. They're the technologies that we use, and that tends to be what we philosophize about and what we fetishize. That's what is in front of us. But what's really interesting are the technologies that make technologies. And I think this, in interesting ways, connects with Kurzweil and what I was trying to say about physical, printers that print printers, is it's the technologies that are out of sight. If you've ever traveled if you've ever gone to a manufacturing plant, the die-cast machines, the machines that make machines, if you go to a carpentry shop or something like that, the table saws, the drills, all the technology that makes the stuff that we hold and play with. We look at these devices, the laptops, the iPhones. These are the ones that we consume and fetishize. But there's this other layer that we've got to look at, which is the manufacturing layer. I mentioned the whole business of thinking about technology as agenda-driven. And a point that Jacques Ellul makes that I think is very important is it's a point about the discourse of technology. And the point he makes is that our discourse of technology focuses on efficiency. What does he mean by that? When we talk about technology, we're always talking about, let's say I have a technology like the iPhone. We're always talking about, is this technology more or less efficient at allowing me to achieve my goals than another technology? How does this phone work better than another phone? The phone itself, the technology is not an end in itself. To go back to Heidegger, we have these long chains of things that we want. Some of them are better articulated than others. You all know that you have, fairly soon you're going to have to go to the bathroom, the class is going to be over. You have some short-term goals. I bet a lot of you are a little bit fuzzy about your long-term goals. Maybe you want to get married and have kids, but you don't really know. Do you want to live in Edmonton? I'm not really sure about that. Maybe I want to go to Calgary or something like that. So, some of the goals get fuzzier as they get further away. But the goals are very different from the technology. The technology is something that helps you achieve those goals. What Jacques Ellul pointed out is that that's the way it should be, but that's not actually the way it is. When we look at the discourse around technology, the discourse around technology has taken on a life of its own. When you read Wired magazine, when you read stuff, people talk about owning an iPhone or an iPad as an end in itself. And it isn't really. And in fact, no discourse of technology can ever actually totally fill the gap which is opened by what in God's name are you doing with your life? I know a lot of you think that if you get another toy that will solve it, and it probably will, or it'll at least sort of distract you for a while. But Ellul is sort of the first person to sort of point out how this discourse, the way we talk about technology, has become a sort of end in itself. He actually makes a historic argument that this is one of the big changes that happens in the 19th century, as we go from being a culture that uses technologies. The Romans had technology. We've had technology all along, to a culture that has become totally fascinated with technology somewhere in the late 19th century. He also makes a point which annoys the daylights out of me and most philosophers. He says about the only other discourse that has any chance of counteracting the discourse of technology is the discourse of revealed religion. So you know down somewhere near Calgary, there's that museum to intelligent design. You know, it's really annoying, and you know, all of us like to ignore those people, or some of us do. But when you ask, who is it who is still trying to talk about what the point of life is? It's not happening in the discourse of technology. It seems like the only people holding on to it are in the Vatican or in various churches. They're the only people on a social level who are still trying to negotiate what the goal of life is independent of technology. So enough on that. Let me give you Dreyfus. Dreyfus is an American philosopher. He has been a critic of AI for a long time. When he first started writing, his first book was What Computers Can't Do. I think that was published in the 60s. Everyone laughed him out of court. Then, of course, AI that had promised us all sorts of great things didn't actually deliver, and so now people are beginning to take him a little bit more seriously. He builds on Heidegger, and he raises a number of questions about technology, and specifically about artificial intelligence. He raises questions about the assumptions that we have when we ask questions about whether or not a technology can whether or not we can build an artificial intelligence. His first set of questions have to do with what he calls the biological assumption. Is what our brain does comparable, analogous to processing information with a computer? Most projects, AI projects, start by assuming that it is. I actually think, and I think even Dreyfus would agree that a lot of what our brain does is like processing information with a computer. But we don't know for sure that everything our brain does can be modeled or artificially automated or artificially reproduced on a computer. Then there's the psychological assumption. Well, actually, I'm going to return to the biological. He draws on another philosopher, Merleau-Ponty, who in turn was very influenced by Heidegger, who Merleau-Ponty believed that our intelligence or our life has to do with our body. When I was talking before about these chains of desires and agendas, a lot of those have to do with our body. We have to go to the bathroom. We want to eat. We want to cuddle with a good friend. Our thinking, a whole mess of you are laughing over there. That laughing is a bodily function. Your thinking, a lot of your thinking is driven by emotions and is driven by the body and is driven by what the body wants and desires and is capable of. And so, following Merleau-Ponty, there's an argument that thinking itself, human thinking, is something that is done in human bodies. That's not to say there aren't other types of thinking, but if we're going to build artificial intelligence that is similar to ours, we're probably going to have to figure out how to encapsulate it in a body that has similar needs and desires and affordances to ours. Or another way to put that is an artificial intelligence, which has its own body, but a very different one, is going to probably have a very different agenda. It's going to have different desires. It's going to have different affordances. It's not going to want to be cuddled. But on the other hand, it might really like popping up little pixels on bank machines or something like that. Psychological assumption that the mind is like a machine operating on information. We don't actually know that the mind operates on information. That's an assumption. It's a good one to make, and it's one that allows us to do all sorts of interesting science, but it is still, in some sense, at the point of analogy. We are going, well, computers operate on information. They seem like a good model for what the mind is, but do we know that the mind is actually operating on information? Or could it be operating on emotion or something else? The epistemological assumption is that all knowledge can be formalized, and the ontological assumption is that the world can be described as a series of facts that can be symbolically represented. The symbolism part is important here, because computers are, as HerbertSimon says, they are symbol processors. And if there are aspects of the world that cannot be represented symbolically, then there are going to be aspects of the world that a symbol processor cannot operate on. What are symbols? The alphabet is a symbol. What is not a symbol? Well, That's the interesting thing. Can we actually distinguish between what is a symbol and what is not a symbol? We can represent things symbolically, but can we capture the complexity and breadth of the world and of our experience in non-symbolic systems, in a symbolic system? I tend to, at the end of the day, I tend to agree with Jerry Fodor, who is an advocate of an approach called computationalism. One aspect of this philosophical approach is, well, we may never know if intelligence can be fully modeled with computing, but it's damn well worth trying. And what he takes is an approach that in some sense is what's happening and I think working, which is a functional approach. He says there are certain functions of the mind which we can formalize and we can try to model with computers. And those functions tend to be the ones which are cognitively impenetrable. What do I mean by cognitively impenetrable? They are the functions that your mind automatically does without you being able to change it in consciousness. A good example is language processing. You guys have incredibly powerful English language processors, such that if I took what I said, if I took the audio track and I chopped out parts of it and played it to you, your language processing module would fill those parts in and you wouldn't even know that there was a difference between what I'm saying and the audio version that has been distorted. You compensate, this autonomous language module is cognitively impenetrable because you can't get into it. You could if I spoke to you in Italian, those of you who don't understand Italian. Because in Italian you have not trained an Italian language module the way you have in English. Another module is your walking module. You guys can walk from here to your dorm and back and think about something completely different than walking. Remember Heidegger and ready to hand? Ready to hand is when you have a trained module that can pick up and do something without consciousness having to deal with it. Those modules, which are in some sense themselves, the brain has automated through training, those are the ones that we are tackling. Those are the ones that Jerry Fodor thinks we can model and automate. But ultimately, Fodor thinks there's one thing that will always be impossible to automate, and that is consciousness. That is the voice right inside your head, or the little space of dialogue, or the sort of whatever it is that you imagine it of, that is you. Thank you very much.
So, questions? You must have questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to ask why prediction is important. Why I have to predict something maybe after 50 or 60 years? Why I have to think how it's going to be the world after 50 or 60 years? Why it's important?
Well, I think that the word I used is hope. I think, first of all, right now, you know, all the things that you do in some sense involve naive predictions. When this class ends, I'm willing to bet that you're going to go out of one of those two doors. And you're going to do that because you predict that the door is the most efficient way to get out of this room and towards wherever it is that you want to go. You are going to be making a series of predictions. Now, it could be that somebody has changed the whole building while we were in here and put a snake pit out there or something like that, and that's not the right way to go. But you're not going to think that way. You automatically are predicting, I want to get from here to dinner or coffee or whatever it is that your desire, your aim, your agenda, and you're going to do a whole series of predictions. So those are very short-term predictions. Then we have the near future. Well, the near future predictions are really important, that's how people make money. You guys are, you're in medicine, or you guys are making predictions about what you will want to do 10 years from now, and you're basing what you study now on those predictions. If you thought that you would be happiest as a short story writer, you wouldn't be in this room. You'd be over in arts taking English. Or maybe your parents would force you to be here anyway, and then you're going to make $1 million and then go back and write short stories. But whatever it is, you're making predictions about your life and the world. And then the long-term predictions, I think, have to do with the long-term hopes. And Heidegger would say they have to do with death. Now, you guys are all too young to think about death. Well, Kim and I are probably old enough. But at some point, death is the end of hope. And death has there's a very interesting relationship with death. If you've ever been really scared, have you ever been in a car and almost had an accident and had a moment of real fear? That, in some sense, is a prediction that you felt. You felt it right in the base of your spine, and it ripped up you, and you shiver. I feel that every time I slip on the ice, actually. So I don't know if that's we should ask Kurzweil. Why is he predicting? Why does he keep on cranking out books predicting that the singularity is going to happen? Well, because he really thinks that we should prepare for it, and that we can anticipate it and we can guide it.
We have 1 minute left. I wanted to say that Leslie Cormack was fascinated by why we would want people from the arts speaking in this course. And I think she thought it's now for something completely different. But there's a kind of lyricism and riveting memory of some of your presentation today that is very good for us to hear, and that we would not get from somebody who is coming to us from the sciences. And so you can look at it two ways. Do we like your presentation because it's going to make good video? Yes. So at that very superficial level. Is it going to help us prepare for the future? Are we better prepared for the future because we've listened to you? And is it going to help us survive? I think it might actually do that. So I think you've succeeded even at the deepest, most meaningful level, and also at the most superficial level of just giving us some lyricism that we need in this course for riveting videos. So we thank you for both of those things.
Well, thank you.
Skirting on the top and getting to the depth. I'm afraid we're out of time, and thank you very, very much for this session.
Thank you.